Welcome and welcome back. We made it somehow to the last dance. Okay, we made it to Dustin Poirier's last walk, and that means we have to talk about Fightville, right? Well, I've been working on a series for this channel where we talk about fight films, anything from the classics to the cults, and yeah, what better time to start this series than with Fightville? Okay, we have The Last Dance and a last chance at a retrospective into Dustin Poirier. If you don't know what Fightville is, according to Wikipedia, it's a martial arts documentary released in 2011. Okay, it was co-directed by Petra Epperlein and Michael Tucker, and the film, again, this is Wikipedia's words, features interviews with a group of Lafayette, Louisiana fighters and coaches, which includes Dustin Poirier, Tim Crater, Albert Steinbach, and other fighters, etc., etc. Okay. Crater, a fighter and coach, is interviewed about Gladiator Academy, which seeks to build better men. Gil, the Thrill Guillory, a promoter of local promotion named USA MMA, is also featured. More than just featured, I will tell you. So this film premiered in April of 2011. That was nearly 15 years ago. That is quite crazy. And since then, Dustin Poirier has become the household name his mother always knew he would be. Let's give this film a dynamic review, a dynamic breakdown, spoilers included. Of course, right? And it's a documentary, so I mean, come on, what spoilers? But let me take you through a journey of retrospection and a once in a lifetime opportunity to take a glimpse into the life and the mind of a legend before he had even become one. It is such a special movie. Some documentaries are some kind of movies in general are but this is a fabulous look into the real, the gritty world of MMA. We start the film with a dramatic voice, okay? We hear a dramatic voice and he's telling us fighting is as old as humankind has ever been. That there's something about beating another man in submission that the world is just attracted to. Mankind is made to be warriors, and we get these flashing scenes of fighting. We're in a fight night. So he's talking, and we get scenes of the cage, and he delivers this brilliant line where he says, "Fighting is truth." That's our introduction. Cue Fightville logo. We get introduced to Gil Guillory as the owner of USA MMA and local mixed martial arts promoter. And he talks a little bit about how very few men will walk the aisles of fighting. Very few will do it 20 times. And you can't do it if you can't give your opponent that crazy look in your eye and expect to get it right back. And he talks about how as being a promoter, he has to be the story writer behind every fighter. He has to write the script that tells these stories. And we get a scene of some crazy ground and pound knockout. I imagine a real culture shock for people who don't come from knowing about this. And when Gil describes what he's trying to do with his promotion, USA MMA, he says, we're bringing back the essence of combat. And he says, I can take any man and I can make him a star. And we see Dustin Poirier, still not introduced, but we know, climb on top of the cage after being, all over his opponent in a very dominant stoppage win. And he gives this shrug, and we get to be introduced to Dustin Poirier. We're introduced to Dustin as rising star, Gladiator Academy. And then Dustin starts talking about his dream to be the best 155-pound fighter in the world. We get some scenes of him hitting the mitts, with his boxing coach, talking about how fighting is in his blood. You can see Gil is in the background as Dustin is boxing, so we get a glimpse into where this is all taking place. And Gil is talking in this gym as this is all going down about developing these young guys, okay? And he talks about how, in essence, this is like the minor league for Strikeforce, RIP, UFC, etc. And they're not going. These fighters are not going to be able to make it to the big time if he doesn't put on these shows, right? How do you make it to the professional level if there's no regional scene? So he's part of maintaining and creating that in Louisiana. And he says something about how, the fans, they have to support. Otherwise, the local guys just can't make it. And the ones with talent, of course. Okay? And then we get to see Dustin talking about just wanting to fight. And that's what brought him to Gladiator. Okay? That's what brought him to fighting MMA, is that he just simply wanted to fight in general. So the quote from Dustin is, when I first started fighting, the sport of fighting, I had not one thought of money or fame or anything like that in my mind. I just wanted to fight. That's it. Simple and plain. I called the place, Gladiator MMA, and I called and I asked them, so if I come over there and train, will I really be against another opponent and get to fight? And he said he was there the next day. So we get some more scenes of Dustin training, and then we see he's working with someone who's kind of putting the beat on him. And he's specifically dominating him when they're on the ground. You can see it's we got little gloves on, but it's just some healthy sparring. And the voice of the man who's on top of Dustin, he's saying, defend, defend. Dustin's saying, I'm stuck. He responds, I know. Come the other way, come this way. He's trying to coach him out of the struggle. And then we get to hear from that mysterious man, who is Tim Crater. And he says, what we're doing today with MMA and mixed martial arts is what martial arts was always supposed to be, which is super interesting. And then Tim is introduced to us as Crazy Tim Crater, owner of Gladiators Academy, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, seasoned UFC fighter, actually the first BJJ black belt in Louisiana. And then we get this really funny scene of Tim and a bunch of guys in the gym dressed in some silly, very cliche, martial arts attire. And they talk about something about how, revitalizing martial arts in America, through MMA, that's essentially, separating what's real from the crazy stuff. Because he says there's no 7-year-old black belts, and there's these scenes of all the guys in the gym being silly, doing all this funny stuff, and as a way to demonstrate that that's what some people think of when they think of martial arts, all this so-called traditional things, but it's all kind of a little bit goofy, and there's a lot of gyms that are maybe a little, I guess you could say, watered down, kind of geared to everybody. And Tim says, to make it for everybody is to make it not what it really is. In Tim's mind, and his philosophy at Gladiator MMA is that it requires the warrior spirit, essentially, to make you a fighter, that it's really not for everybody. And then it cuts to Tim talking to the guys in the gym, telling them to make sure to wipe up their blood. And then we get some shots of Louisiana. We go back to Gil, and he's talking about the excitement of a live event. Bring excitement to the live event of fighting. That's essentially what he's trying to do. He's bringing the fighting to the rodeo arenas, to the civic centers, and it's just him, his wife, and his kids running the show. And his wife, Lori, she's talking, laughing. We get to hear from her for the first time about how a lot of people are, they say it's human cockfighting, and she's heard that so many times, and how she reflects about how, it probably was back then, but how much the sport has evolved, and we allow things like NASCAR and the rodeo, which can be very, very dangerous, and, even boxing, there's a lot more damage that can be sustained, and the sport has evolved. And there's this really interesting line where she says, talks about blood being superficial, and it's true. Things can look really dire, but those wounds can be oftentimes superficial and not a chronic type of damage. And the reality is that the sport is not as dangerous as it seems. And then we go back to Gil. We get a little bit more insight to why he is a mixed martial arts promoter. Why is he even doing this? And it's because Gil the Thrill, as his wife, it talks about him being a pro boxer, was a pro wrestler as well. We get some tape, Gil the Thrill, Gil and Al. And, he says something about how a lot of people approach him, they think they're ready, they think they can fight. And Gil's 38 at the time of this being filmed. And he says that he'll spar with these kids. And if they, really see if they want to fight, because as somebody with experience, he can really put that on them. He says 5 guys walk off the street and he's looking for one thing: dedication. And then we get our first introduction to Albert Steinbach, and we see him working with Gil. They're doing a little light boxing sparring. And Albert talks right away about fighting being a spiritual thing. He opens up, the first thing that we hear him saying is about how he's actually afraid to get punched. He's very honest about that, as most people actually are. But then he talks about once he's in there and he's free, and yeah, it talks about the spiritual element, and he describes the universe as this big machine that he's just kind of operating in. It's a pretty powerful statement. And he says he doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in determinism, and he thinks that fighting is the only thing that he's good at. And you see him kind of thinking for a moment that maybe he doesn't really believe that. And then he adds a little bit at the end. He says about, after saying that he thinks it's the only thing he's good at, that he kind of wants it to be his only option, which is really interesting. And then we get back to Gil, and you can hear Gil talking about Albert, saying that, he's got, he's a really interesting kid, but he thinks that he isn't only good at fighting. That's the first thing Gil says. And he thinks he could be really good at anything he puts his mind to, almost kind of hinting that he wishes that Albert would direct his energy somewhere else as opposed to fighting. It's kind of an interesting sentiment from Gil, and you could tell Gil really has a lot of care and love for the fighters, and he talks about how it's really important, and a big mistake that a lot of fighters make is not creating a life after fighting. Essentially just, he says 99% of fighters end up broke and destitute. Basically, no one's making a penny, especially not in 2009. That money can often just times go away. And so Gil talks about the importance of having a plan after fighting. And then we get a little bit of a sparring moment between Albert and Dustin, and then we get to see them working together in Gladiator MMA, kind of connecting the pieces. Okay, so Tim, he's the coach, he's the leader, Gil's promoting, so intimately involved, and then we have the two talents in the space. And then Albert talks about practicing the stare down, visualizing all his routine, how he beats his chest when he go out there. And then we go to Dustin's perspective. He says something so Dustin about how, people who haven't been in there, they don't realize how peaceful it is inside of there and how pure. That's what he says. And it shows them a really interesting scene of them staring each other down. I mean, they're not, they're sparring buddies, so they're not actually facing off, but you can see the energy, both of them in that moment. And then we cut back to Albert. He says something, about Dustin, when he says when Dustin's in there, he looks like a serial killer, and that I feel the same way about myself. And then we cut to some scenes of a rodeo space, and then we get the athletic commissioner, kind of being real stern with the fighters that are surrounding. We see we're gearing up for a fight night, telling them that he doesn't want anyone getting hurt, but that they're all taking that chance, et cetera, et cetera. Then we get Gil saying that he's not selling fights, that they're selling entertainment. And we get our first title screen, arguably our first chapter. Chapter 1, Fight 1, New Iberia. Natural Disaster 3, August 2009. And we get a quote from Bruce Lee that says, "The key to immortality is first to live a life worth remembering." And then we get Albert talking about wanting to be remembered and about a little bit more of his fight mentality, the feeling of being a monkey, and just, it doesn't matter what my story is, what his story is. It's about who's more fit to survive. And you can't feel sorry for anybody. And we see image of Albert fighting, so we get led up to that fight night, Natural Disasters 3, which is funny title, and Albert gets the win by submission. So we have that overlay of his fighting and hearing from him, and he gets that rear naked choke, okay? And then we get Dustin. So in that event, Dustin is the headliner, Albert is on the undercard, and we get Dustin talking about how he prays that nobody gets hurt in there. and he knows he's gonna get hit. That would be like going to the office and not touching paper. That's what he says. And then we get some scenes of Dustin fighting, and you can see that classic Dustin energy. I mean, so long ago, 20 years ago, almost 15 years ago, but that same, finisher energy. And Tim is talking, as you can see Tim in his corner, talking about how Dustin's a finisher. He says, me and him, we're finishers, not looking to win rounds, looking to do whatever it takes to stop the fight. And at this point, Albert and Dustin have both picked up a win in that same night. We get Tim talking a little bit more about sacrifice and talent being a necessary combo. That's exactly what you need, and how you only run into, he says, maybe one or two people like that in your life. And he says it's really exciting to see Dustin, who may be one of those guys. That just really is such a moment, because now we know that he is. What a retrospect. That just really touches me. And Tim says that the biggest challenge at this moment in this stage of Dustin's career is finding someone that he's not going to kill in a couple of minutes. Actually getting him a real challenge, because he seems to just be steamrolling in this very early moments of his pro career, okay? And then we get Gil talking similarly about Dustin. He says that Dustin at age 20 has the potential, okay? He says, will he make it to the UFC? Will he be world champion? Potentially. But potential has a time frame. It's very fascinating. Gil says that if you still have potential at 38, you got to give it up. And here we are, right? Really crazy. So Gil also gives Tim's Creators Gym the nod for talent, for having people like Dustin, a lot of other people who really know how to fight and have that potential to make it on the national scale. But he says that it doesn't mean anything until they're there, basically, which we see that all the time. People who still dominating regionally, doesn't translate, okay? And then we get another quote. We get a quote from Nietzsche. Every talent must unfold itself in fighting. Here we get a glimpse of Dustin's background a little bit more. And Dustin's mom, Jerry, is introduced, and she talks about Dustin being a fighter basically since day one. We get a couple of stories here and there about him running in the law, skipping school, juvie. We get cuts to like his tattoos, a lot of which he's covered up. And then we hear from Dustin talking about how he feels that fighting was his only path to redemption. We get an incredible picture of him and his wife, Jolie, and it's just so funny because it's just such a throwback. Okay, they are ride or dies. If you don't know, they are ride or dies. It's such a love story. It's incredible. And we go back, kind of cutting back and forth between him and his mom saying that he finally found his thing. And then we hear again from Tim talking about martial arts being about respect, honor, dignity, and not being taught that in school. He's like, I learned math, I learned science, but he didn't learn about martial arts, which really develops you as a person. And you see Tim teaching in his gym, and he's talking about how everybody expresses their martial arts differently. And he's telling his class of students, how I express my jiu-jitsu is different from how you express your jiu-jitsu. I think that's one of the best quotes of the film. And then it's followed up by another one of the best quotes of the film. Pretty much Tim, he's out there with the wisdom. And then Tim, along that lines of, expressing jiu-jitsu and martial arts differently, he says, all painters use the same paints, the same canvases, the same types of brushes, but the paints themselves are so different and so beautiful and so glorious to watch. And when we fight, that's when we make our masterpieces. And then we get another quote from Walt Whitman, and if the body were not the soul, what is the soul? And then Gil is promoting another event, and he's talking about Dustin being the headliner, going against a BJJ black belt, Ronnie Liz and Paul Swallow going against Albert in Albert's pro debut. So at this point, Dustin has started his pro career, not yet signed to a major promotion, and Albert is having his pro debut. We show Albert, get some background about Albert staying back, waiting tables, talking about this being his first pro fight and needing to pay rent, how it's getting serious. And then we get Tim again talking about that. Pretty sequential lead in. Fighting is a 40-hour-a-week job. It's a grind. We get shots of Albert and Dustin both in the gym getting ready for their respective fights, Dustin as the headliner. And Albert talks about how training with Tim really pushes him the way that he wants. That he says that Tim's the only person that talks to him the way that he talks to himself in his head. And then we get some insight more into Tim and his coaching style. So we see Tim, okay, gloved up, and then we see someone in front of him. And we're like, oh, who's this new person? And it pauses, and you see the title screen. It says, Corey Judas has not been training for the fight. And then we get some, talk from Albert about, like, as overlay, as Tim's about to start sparring this person, about how if you haven't been training, Tim will definitely let you know how he feels. And then we see Tim really, really put the hurt on Corey, who has been skipping training. So basically, Tim is beating Corey up for not showing up. Right? And afterwards, because Corey's really sassy as he's getting his ass beat, because it's, like, pretty bad. Like, Dustin, like, makes this face. He goes, like, he winces because it's that bad. It's pretty bad. And so Corey claps back a little while it's happening, and Tim says that, if he can't clap back, he didn't show up, that's not his fault, and if he ever does it again, then he's out of the gym forever. Very stern. And then, Tim says you're not expected to win every fight, but you're expected to train. Makes a lot of sense. Then we get a title screen, okay, 3 weeks before, and so Corey, this guy who just got beat up in sparring, and it's his fight. And Tim's talking about how you can't just fight to survive, you have to fight to win. And basically that if you give up, it's those next punches after you give up that are so devastating. And ain't that the truth, right? I mean, in the most literal sense, when your body gives up, like, you get knocked out and those punches come and raining down that the ref is always trying to stop, like, those are the ones that are the most devastating. Similarly to when you give up mentally. And you see Corey in this fight getting wailed on, like the actual fight 3 weeks prior. And, Tim is saying he's thankful that he made it out of there, that he won, but that he took a lot of damage. And then we hear more about Albert's background, and it's really unfortunate. He talks about some pretty sad stuff, his upbringing, just with being very abusive and very tumultuous very early, and just some of the things that he had to witness, that he feels that if he were to give himself, in his words, a Freudian analysis, that he wants to be a defender as a result of all of the terrible things that he saw. And so that's kind of an insight into how Albert sees himself as a pro fighter. Like, what is he trying to fulfill with this dream? Because everybody's got a different dream. And then we cut to Dustin talking similarly about what does that mean to be a professional fighter. He's signing papers, signing little Dustin Poirier autographs. And he says, is fighting my profession? Is that what I do to provide for me and my wife? I'm trying to make it that. In response, people ask him what he does, he says he's a delivery driver because he's not quite making money just from fighting to really support himself. And we hear his mom, she's much more proud of him than he is of himself at that moment. I mean, I get it. She's saying he's accomplished so much, talking about how he went from an alcoholic kid to a professional fighter. She says that he's her hero, and she knows that he's going to do it, make it to the top of the sport, and that he's going to be amazing. And she says that she knows he's going to be a household name. And boy, was she right. Then we get another quote that says, without promotion, something terrible happens. And we get another scene of Gil promoting. This film is a lot of Gil going around just trying to pick up steam, trying to sell tickets for these fights, okay? So we get Gilly's on the radio. He's got a radio show at this point. And then we see him that, and then we have him talking, like, to the documentary interviewers about how he could make anybody look good with the right promoting. And he just says some funny stuff about that, about how and it's true, we still see that there's a lot of fights that are maybe a little wonky, but they're sold to be maybe more than what they are. But yeah, promotion is everything, right? Without promotion, something terrible happens. Yes. And then we get a scene of Albert actually signing a contract for his pro fight. And we see Dustin getting ready. So they're both getting ready to appear again on the same fight card. Dustin's the headliner once more. So we get that title card about Albert signing a pro contract. We get a title card telling us that Dustin will cut 20 pounds in less than a week. and he's running on that treadmill. He's sweating, and he's saying some funny stuff about how he's ready to fight right now. This is the fight right now. And then we see some more behind the scenes with Gil and his wife Lori reading about some of the press that has been surrounding the event. One person having said that this is disgusting. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it never comes back here. And Lori's kind of laughing as she's reading that, and she's like, I don't know if that's good or bad. And Gil just very straight, it's good. All press is good. And then we get a glimpse on Dustin's incoming opponent, just very briefly, Ronnie Liz, a BJJ black belt. So really generating the story there of a very confident Brazilian with that skill. He's like, I'm going to show him what martial arts really is. And then we see Albert talking more about his fight and saying that stepping into the cage is proving it, and he's proved it to himself, hyping himself up there. So that is chapter 1. Chapter 1 is like the the second, because we start in the introduction seeing both Albert and Dustin fight, and then we get the fight in New Iberia, and then the build up, and then in chapter 2, fight 2. Okay, this is Border Wars. Border War 2 in Lake Charles, November 2009. And so after the weight cut, after all that, we're here. We made it to the night of the fight. We see Dustin and Albert in the locker room. Albert's got his head in his hands. Dustin's sitting there. You can hear the fights happening in the background. And then we get some Tim talking about how once upon a time, when MMA was starting out and being, when martial arts was being revitalized in America, since BJJ is kind of how it all started with MMA, that for a while there's a lot of arrogance. Tim is saying, not me, okay? Tim is saying in Brazil, Brazilians thinking that they can just crush an American, but now going into this fight, Dustin has 2 black belts. So those days of UFC 1, right, where we had people going into the cage who hadn't been introduced to BJJ, those days are over. Tim is reflecting, and then we get to see pretty brief of both fights. So we Albert first, obviously, since Dustin's the headliner, in order of operation. And Tim talks about Albert's will to finish, and we see Albert get the finish. And but it was after his opponent was like dominating him the whole time. So there's some boos, there's some whatever. Then we get to see our main event, Dustin, in what was supposed to be his biggest challenge yet against an opponent who was saying he was going to finish him in the first round. Lo and behold, it's Dustin who finishes his opponent, Ronnie, in the first round. Then we get some reflections, the person who lost to Albert talking about he wants a rematch. And then we get Albert talking about how history is written by the victor. Okay, because the loser's dead. So true. 3 months later, Albert will face Paul in a rematch, and Dustin will fight for the 155-pound championship, okay, of USA MMA. And then we get just the most, the coolest cut ever. It's just, one of my favorite parts in the entire movie, where Dustin is training, he's training so hard, and it's, a festival in New Orleans, and it's just such a beautiful, and we got the music that's happening in the parade, and just it's, one of the best training montage scenes ever, and it's not even that. It's just because it's Dustin and it's Louisiana. But then in contrast, we see Albert struggling, talking about how he hasn't been making it to the gym. And he says about how a lot of people, when they have a hard time, that's where they go. But for him, it's kind of the opposite. And then we have Tim talking about how Albert can't pull out of the fight because it's 2 weeks away. And then we get this, kind of telephone talking, and Tim's talking to Gil, and he's telling Gil, just find another opponent. Let me handle Albert. He's not ready to fight. I'll take care of it. Obviously, there has to be some sort of team punishment for that. But find him another opponent. Don't talk to him. Talk to me. And then Gil doesn't listen. Gil says, whatever, Tim. And he goes and he talks to Albert, and he says that he doesn't think he should fight unless he really needs the money. And then it's really hard. He's Gil's asking Albert, just tell me you're not going to fight. And Albert can't. He doesn't want to. He knows that he shouldn't, because he hasn't been training, because his life has been lifing, but he doesn't want to say it. He says, give me till the end of the day. Then we're in the gym. Albert has shown up to train today, and you get a scene of Dustin essentially just whooping on him. And he gets a hug afterwards. Okay, he survives the couple rounds. He gets a hug. Dustin gives him a hug. Tim consoles him. But it was rough, okay? And then you see Albert sitting there reflecting, and he says he's thankful. He's thankful for the whooping he received because it really puts it in perspective how, not ready he is, and that's out of love. And we get the title card, Albert decides not to fight. This is a really powerful moment in the documentary as we're well past the halfway point. Tim is reflecting on this moment, talking about how, in fighting, we are often our own worst enemy in life. Unfortunately, Albert beat himself. And fighting is that microcosm for life. So you're not going to be ready to fight if you're out here not showing up. And that is just expressions of life. And we see Dustin continuing to work hard, getting ready, taking this so seriously as he always does. And Tim saying, for Dustin to lose, it's going to take someone to beat him because Dustin's not going to beat himself. Moment of silence for that truth. That moment really got to me. That was so special. And then we finally get introduced to Dustin's boxing coach. We've been seeing him like here and there at Gladiator MMA, but we hadn't seen him. We haven't met him. Bad Chad Broussard. Okay, that's our boxing coach. And he says some really cool stuff about, he's training with Dustin. He says, everybody can walk, but, to be a runway model, everyone has to learn how to walk. And that's actually like a really thought-provoking statement when you think about it. And then he talks about, boxing and MMA are going to end, something Gil was talking about before, and that if they didn't learn anything, then it's kind of all in vain. And they're training, it's really close to this next fight, and Gil's in there laughing about how if Dustin lost, about how that'd be better for the promotion, and Dustin makes this face, he's like, it's really funny, and just gearing up, we're getting ready, we're very, very close. And there's more shots of Gil just promoting. He's on TV, he's going around. So we see him doing some TV stuff, and then we see behind the scenes talking about he's stressed, $55K on the line. Like if the tickets don't sell, that he's just a normal guy. It's back to work, or what have you. And then we're really close, so we get some scenes of Dustin eating basically nothing and watching the Food Network while he is dreaming about chocolate peanut butter ice cream sandwiches from Walmart. He talks about how he's eating raw coconut butter as a supplement for carbs, and that sounds disgusting. Ew. But it's a great scene of him just watching the Food Network and just the hunger. It's like a way to test himself. And we get a little peek into his superstition. So he holds up a Target bag, says that the clothes that he's going to wear to the weigh-ins, that they have to be in a Target bag. That he's going to have the Walgreens Mango Pedialyte, Juicy Fruit bubble gum, and gray underwear for the weigh-in. So we got a man of superstition. And then it's night of the fights. Gil is in the Cajun Dome. So we went from rodeo to Cajun Dome, and he's reflecting about that transition and about how if they can sell this, they get another chance at the rodeo arena because those can be even bigger. And he's scared of this big step. Essentially, he's stressed. We get our weigh-ins, get some fun preview. The announcer doing his tie. He's practicing how to say Dustin's name in front of the mirror. Dustin Poirier. And then we make it to Fight 3, Night of Champions 2 in Lafayette, March of 2010. And we get Dustin's coach, his boxing coach, looking dead in the camera saying, Dustin Poirier will hit Derek Krantz so hard the alarm in the nearby bank will go off. We get some scenes of some of the fights that are leading up to Dustin's fights. Looks like a wild night. And then it's time for Dustin to make the walk. We see his mom. We get some Johnny Cash playing, and this fight goes beyond round one, so we get some corner moments where we get Chad and Tim motivating Dustin, telling him this guy doesn't want to stand with you, he wants to take you down. And Dustin, of course, gets the win by submission, his biggest win yet against Derek Krantz. Massive. Derek Krantz, the belt holder. At the time, Dustin wins a belt. And he's walking with the belt. It's a great moment. It's just such a, he's making his way. He's so close to finally breaking through to a major promotion like the UFC. And he says, people say that this is a crazy dream or like a fantasy dream that he's chasing, that he won't be able to do it. What's their dream? What are they going to do with their life? I could cry. I could cry right now. It's just amazing because look at what he's done. He's done reach the top of the sport. And to see him with this drive at this time, it really touches your heart. So at that point, the film's almost over, and Dustin needs the test, something to get him to break into the major leagues, to break into the UFC. And we get Gil talking about how he wishes, that he was like Dustin, that he thought like him, that he did that at his age, right? Because Dustin's like 20 years old. He's barely 20 years old. Talks about that dangerous word potential. And then we get the title card. 3 months later, again, Dustin's in Canada to fight an undefeated champion. And if he wins, he'll be signed by a major league. So this is our first journey outside of Louisiana and the last fight of the film. Ringside MMA 7, No Escape, Montreal, June 2010, in enemy territory. And as Tim puts it, somebody's dreams are going to get crushed tonight. And we're fairly certain it's going to be Derek's. So we got 2 Derek's back to back. And Tim is talking about how this is such a crucial moment in Dustin's career. This is a venturing outside of Louisiana. Like, he's been ruling his home territory, and now he's going to go fight in somebody else's home turf. Tim as a UFC fighter, having made that walk before, how it changed him as a person, and how essentially at this moment, Dustin's just being brought in there to be beat. Like, that's why he's being put here, is to win, so this undefeated champion can walk through him. Spoiler, Dustin gets it done, and we get to see Albert watching, excited for his friend, his training partner, and he gets the knockout in 57 seconds. He's a finisher. It's a really beautiful, emotional moment where, Tim is talking about how he loves these guys. He's hugging Dustin, and we get the title card saying that Dustin is signed by the UFC. He made it to the top level, opened the door, and that is essentially where his story ends in this film. But it's just the beginning, right, of the story of Dustin Poirier. So incredible. And we get Tim talking to us some more, talking about, this is one of the biggest moments in the film, where he's reflecting on how far Dustin's come. He's saying, our main goal is not to win titles or win champions or be the greatest. We build better men. And, Albert got back in there. And we end the film with the source of the cover right there, that moment. Albert trained harder, and he made the walk again. And we see Albert walking out in his little magician hat, doing that pose, and that's it. Fightville. It ends with Dustin getting a contract and with Albert getting back to it. And what an incredible story, right? Just the beginning. Who would have thought the person that Dustin would become? Perhaps everybody who has ever known him. So that's Fightville. That's the story. That's the breakdown. Please watch this movie. If you haven't, you need to, okay? Watch this movie. It's available for rent for a couple bucks. If you got a couple bucks, watch it. Fightville, what an incredible opportunity. As we said, a retrospective. I'd say I'd give this movie 10 out of 10 because it's Dustin Poirier. But as far as documentaries go, maybe a 8, 7.5. It's very good. It's very, very good. I would highly recommend. And that's all we got. Thanks for hanging out. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you check out the film. If you've seen it, let me know. Okay? And let me know if you loved it. Peace out.